Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing ghosts, devils, and magic in African American belief systems and how this important tradition has shaped American folklore, including in the Ozarks. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or about any other podcast platform. So what in traditional African and African American belief systems would sound familiar today?
I think that would surprise many people how much of this lore has aspects that ring with familiarity. And it is an incredibly rich world of ghosts, of conjure and witchcraft. But there's just a lot of aspects that both positively and negatively made their way or were portrayed in popular culture. And a lot of this also has impacted today's paranormal field. These are things that directly impact these subjects, both paranormal research and pop culture here in the Ozarks. And to me, it's just incredibly fascinating.
And we'll return to how African American beliefs in the paranormal have impacted our current pop culture and folklore. But first, we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book Dark Ozarks: The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in that drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with the noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Good stuff. And really, really interesting, complex topic for tonight.
It really is. And in ways that often we aren't conscious of how it has impacted our current belief systems, particularly about the paranormal and some of these other subjects.
I definitely agree with that. It's very, well, for one, and I think that there is often negative connotations associated with some aspects of this belief structure. A lot of individuals may still have a negative impact, a negative opinion on things like voodoo and hoodoo. And I would say a reasonable amount of fear even to this day.
I think so. It's, if nothing else, just from reinforcement over time that, assuming that that's what is reality when it's a lot more complex than that.
It is. And of course, we're dealing with a root base, a core, a foundation of traditional African religions, strong emphasis on West African religions, and then introducing the various aspects of those ideas, and I tend to land on the term cosmology rather than religion, because it is different than what most of us with a Western framework or a colonial European framework think of when we think of religion. It is, and that was something that appears to have been, consistently a very painful aspect of the process from a personal belief system that many of the individuals who were brought over against their will as part of the slave trade were forcibly introduced to Christianity and forcibly introduced to a categorization of religion in this box as opposed to other things in other boxes. And that really goes against the overarching cosmology of many of these West African belief structures, because it was belief structures that were, quite frankly, very extraordinarily in very complicated, powerful, and intuitive seeming ways, interwoven throughout all aspects of life. So it wasn't something that you just put in a box in this category, separate from other categories. These were concepts, and this is something that I think we'll see throughout the discussion tonight. These are great and complex cosmological ideas that are interwoven from the deeply personal to what we would think of as the mundane and the day-to-day, to aspects involving things like medicine, justice, or law, family, personal development, quote unquote, or growth and aging, to crops, to meteorology, to weather. All of these things having a complex interworking nature that was very being forced to think of things from a Enlightenment, a Western colonial perspective, everything in categorical boxes. It was very foreign. First of all, it was an alien way of thinking. The Western mindset was a very alien concept, and being forced to function under those rules had to have been a incredibly personally painful experience before you even add in all of the other aspects of what was going on.
Exactly. And we have talked various times about the duality in culture traditions, and how that is a little different than the Enlightenment period, etc., and other areas of Europe. And there is a bit of not a sameness, but a parallel between these two in some ways, these two belief traditions, that there is duality, there is interconnectedness. And I think that part of the issue is that for the West African people being brought over, it was a sudden change, whereas the Celtic people, things were, integration with other peoples, with the Romans, etc. Over time, it was much more gradual. And ironically, a lot of those Celtic traditions were lost in that process. And it's amazing when you start going through the research how much of the West African belief systems really survived, considering the trauma that was being experienced.
It is. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of people who were cut off from their ancestral structures. And then forced to assimilate into other structures. It is, I would say, almost miraculous to see the amount of survival of belief structures and systems that took place. What is very positive, I think, is that the West African cosmology remained largely intact in Africa. So
Mhm.
we do have, unlike with the Celts, we are dealing with structures that current, contemporary anthropological and religious studies can be done on to really understand
True.
these systems in ways that we simply don't have a fully fledged out record with the Celts. And then we can, and it has been done in many cases, make those transatlantic comparisons and see how much was able to be retained, how much was destroyed, and in many cases, something that in the course of 2 to 3 generations, oftentimes pretty quickly, largely in the late 18th century, early 19th century, we see a situation where in comparatively short time, the individuals who were uprooted and their connections, their physical connections severed, but their spiritual and energetic connections being retained and then in secret, typically passed on to the next generation. And these were things that gave a sense of hope, a sense of identity, a sense of ancestral meaning, and a sense of nationalistic reform, as well as a militant response, and played a huge role in a number of successful as well as unsuccessful revolutions. The most notable being in Haiti, modern day Haiti, and Jamaica, but also clearly impacting, of course, in the antebellum South of the U.S. The threat of slave revolt was a dominant fear, and the references to the revolution in Haiti were made often that they did not want that sort of thing happening here.
Mhm.
Although not, it's difficult to tread into this territory without inflammatory aspects, but there the cultural substrate in the US, while not great by any stretch, was not good in many cases. It was very different than what was going on in Haiti as well.
True, there were differences, um, and actually Jamaica. You mentioned Jamaica. That's a good example of a radical departure from the past for people, and how much of a threat it was viewed. Is that going back to 1760, Obaya was outlawed, and that's basically this belief system that technically is, in religious in part, as well as folklore and conjure, etc., that it was seen as such a threat that it was outlawed.
It was, and this is, to me, this is really interesting. Before we began doing in-depth research on this, I was a lot less familiar with the Jamaican Obi or Obia tradition, but it encapsulates so many of the West African diaspora structure, tradition, magic, as well as what I'm going to temporarily at least refer to as colonial whites' superstitions about it,
Right.
as well as genuine fears associated with it. And the court record and the indicators regarding the revolution in Jamaica with the folk tradition, magic, the cosmology associated with it, to me is really fascinating because, first of all, the contemporary court records are really skirting that very interesting line between, are we outlawing it because it's a silly superstition and such things are just bad for the people who don't know any better, or are we outlawing it because we're afraid of it? And
True, and it's real.
it's and if we're afraid of it, now you can make arguments that it was, as a structure, was igniting militaristic and revolutionary zeal, and providing a sense of place and a sense of structure and a sense of culture for a people that otherwise, being cut off from all of those things, would have been easier to prevent from moving to violence or moving into revolution. But the other side of it is, and I can't help but leaned toward this, is that you put the colonials, and the European colonials, in the situation, and while they could espouse, and we all have we all have our own fabricated narratives in terms of how the world works, and these are individuals who, quite frankly, were moving forward in terms of plantation, in terms of colonialism, in terms of the spread of Western civilization, Western values, and of course a very unique religion, if you will, a fusion of Enlightenment rationalism and structured either Catholicism or structured Protestantism that was largely state sanctioned. And the idea of certainly that overarching what would be called in the United States manifest destiny, the right to rule, the right to expand, those types of things. I tend to imagine those individuals feeling very secure in their belief structures, very, very solid in their ideas when they were in places like Paris and London, far, far away from the threat of overarching revolt that could take over the entire island, and in the case of Haiti and Jamaica, ultimately did. But we also know that for all of us, under the right circumstances, it is, especially under duress, the idea that everything that we thought was the way the world works can crumble under certain circumstances. And I can't help but think that a number of these individuals really began to wonder with these Obeah men and women, with the conjure, with the idea that the magic that was taking place, the idea that the Obeah men could kill people without touching them, that they could conjure invincibility against bullets into an army, that they could raise natural forces at their will. We're really talking about something that old Europeans would have recognized as Germanic shamans or druids, Celtic druids.
Exactly. And I think if you went back 200 or 300 years to medieval times, the church accommodated that sort of that dance between the two worlds. Whereas once the Enlightenment came along and then the Protestantism, they did not allow for that was not an allowance, because it can't be real. None of it can be real. And
right.
that put them in a real box from a theoretical perspective, a religious perspective, as well as practical perspectives. And it's kind of interesting because really, as you described what these fears were, and that's what they were fearing, to be honest, you could have just basically taken that out of a plot line from a movie about voodoo over the last 40 years. And so these ideas and wrestling with these concepts is something that still intrigues us, and in very real ways is still among us with modern traditions. but I do find it interesting. You mentioned the court records. I found it interesting that they especially as an attorney, they had to wrestle with, because of their post Enlightenment viewpoints. They had a real problem of, as you said, why are we outlawing this? And part of it has to do with, if we acknowledge this by outlawing it, we admit that witchcraft and evil and necromancy and all these things are real things. And then we open a whole nother can of worms. And from a legal perspective, I found it interesting sort of how they sidestepped the issue was by describing, they had to define what Obeah was, and then basically, particularly with the witchcraft and craft aspect of it, saying that practitioners were pretending to use witchcraft, conjure, etc. So that way, that allowed them to have the Chinese wall to say it's not real, but here's why we're doing this. And them pretending is the danger.
Yes.
Pretty flimsy logic, but
it's absolutely not real, and they're all just pretending. And yet we are zealously outlawing it because pretend. It is an interesting interplay. And of course, it could be argued, obviously, that whether it's real or not, and for the record, I believe that it is. I
do too. I've seen things that I can't deny.
And I've experienced spaces, which we'll get into in the more nuts and bolts. We both experienced spaces that have been changed as a result of conjure. And this is easily 100, 120, 130 years after the fact.
Or more, yeah.
Yeah, it's those types of things. That's not a ripple in time and space, for to use Star Trek terms, for whatever that's worth. But these are not changed spaces based on something that's pretend.
No, there is definitely an impact on the environment, the space, and I believe people. So, and to be honest, if it didn't have a power to, if at a minimum embolden the enslaved population to rebel against massive odds, that in itself is a powerful energy.
It is. It is. And you look at these revolutions, you look at the results of these revolutions, and that in and of itself, to a degree, speaks for the situation, for the cosmology. There's on a what could be considered for us in our Western categorical minds could be considered non-supernatural, is the herbal and healing traditions, or more specifically, the use of plants. And I think that the use of plants within this structure of lore is extraordinarily powerful in terms of interpreting the rest of it, because it is the idea, first of all, that plants are powerful.
Yes.
It is the understanding that occult knowledge of plants, and by occult, I mean by the very traditional, literal sense of the hidden knowledge of plants, is very powerful. And that with plants, you can do things. And if you need someone, if you have a need for something done, you seek out a practitioner and pay them, and they then do things. And that the power, the knowledge necessary to accomplish the thing, the power that resides within the plant, and the end result, the goal, the need, and the goal, that these are just four spaces of this interlocking reality. And the point where if there is a shift, which for our Western minds would be a shift between, oh, that's physical science, and then at what point does it shift over and become more than that? At which point does it shift into a cosmology? At which point does it shift into quote unquote magic? At which point do these things happen? It doesn't matter. That's the idea, that it all is there.
That's true, and I think that it's that paper dragon notion, basically, that Western Europeans developed, that you have a real supernatural and you have a fake one. The fake one is relegated to folklore, and it doesn't exist. The real one is what is propagated by the faith at that time, whether it's Catholics or Protestants, or independent on where you're at. And because you cut that cord between them, it creates these tensions, and it creates not only a theological and philosophical issue, it creates a very practical issue for people, because suddenly you are wrenched away from sort of half of life and told that it's silly, that it doesn't exist. But yet we still turn around and, we plant by the moon, and we, knock on wood, and we do these things. And that's okay, as long as it doesn't go too far over into whatever is defined as silly and nonsense.
And again, that constant tension, very, very interesting, particularly looking at it from this more dimensional cosmology, because first of all, and coming back to the plants, I think are an excellent example that the plants do things, and the plants, under certain circumstances and in certain guidance and certain association with supernatural forces and with specific combinations and certain preparations, do things. Which things are good, which things are bad? No, you're asking the wrong question. The question is, what do you need?
Right. And it's kind of interesting. And this is actually very interesting, because I actually read an article just yesterday on genetics. In my free time. I was sitting somewhere. And there's actually a growing field of research that plants, and actually everything we eat, with the micronutrients in them, actually change our genome. Now, that's very physical, that's very scientific, etc. In the same space, you could define that as magic.
Yes, you could. And I would argue that it is indeed magical, even if you can observe it. I mean, I think one of the things that we have this idea is, if it can be observed and quantified, it's no longer magic. yet we are surrounded with extraordinary things that I would classify as magic. And along this line with the plants, using this as an example, this is a line of thought that I'm just have been percolating on all day. So here goes. But there is what I would classify, let's see if I can do this. There is what I would classify as a post-colonialist, myopic post-colonialism that we are still struggling within the Western mindset to get out of. And even as we are decrying the Western mindset, even as we are saying, oh, we don't want to be like those bad European colonials, etc., they were operating under, in many cases, an unconscious series of structures. They were operating under their cosmology because that was the world that they knew. And we are doing the same. And something that, and I'm going to have a real life example here in just a second, that does relate to Obia specifically, but this entire West African diaspora of belief structure in the Americas. That today we look at these structures, we look at the evils of colonialism that was perpetrated upon a wide variety of peoples, and we look at, for example, the fear that plantation owners, etc., had. We'll look at the fear in association with voodoo, the fear associated with Obia, the fear associated with Santeria, the fear associated with hoodoo, and the root workers, and the threat of revolt. We look at that and we say, okay, from our now post-colonial mindset, there is only one option, and yet it is an option that is oftentimes still locked in to our old mindset. This option is those bad people, quote unquote, were afraid of the West Africans. And that is unbelievably silly. Now, first of all, I think that's very condescending, because every cosmology has power. And if you're like me and you do attribute various cosmologies as having real supernatural impacts, there's nothing silly about it.
No, I agree. I ascribe to that view as well.
That there were and are individuals, practitioners within these spaces, and we'll go back to the historic revolutions, specifically, individuals within these spaces who were conjuring, who were practicing their cosmology in very real and powerful ways, and were giving those plantation owners, those authoritarian structures, etc., reason to have pause. They were giving them reason to be afraid. They were giving, because they were practicing for real, and they were impacting the world around them in a wide variety of ways. And so us, here we are, century or two removed, looking back at, say, for example, these these records from the plantations, etc., where there is trepidation, where there is nervousness, even if it is nervousness veiled within a more Western mindset, and be like, oh, those silly superstitious colonialists or whatever. I think that, and part of it is an unwillingness, and now we get to my final point, an unwillingness to look at the cosmology of this particular diaspora and not equate anything dangerous with it.
Right. And it and then on top of that, in the same breath, they have to say just the opposite, because and it's that it's that circular logic, even if it's unspoken, that informs the situation, and you see it carry over into the United States, the colonies on the continent, with this balance and this give and take, a tug of war of power through these cosmologies.
Yes. And I think that it's fair to look at these as warring supernatural cosmologies to such a large degree.
I think that's very fair. And when we get to the point of talking about some of the ghost lore, it becomes very obvious.
It does. It does. And there's and I've seen this in a number of things, particularly some of the more superficial readings that are from a post-colonialist standpoint, saying, oh, this was considered very negatively in times past, so we're just going to call it, this very, very happy, positive folk religion, because we're not like those bad people in the past that had a negative opinion of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very important to understand that there's a difference between having a negative opinion of something as opposed to recognizing that something has value that is very powerful. I have loud neighbors riding by in the street. My windows are open. That is very powerful, and that power can be used from an outsider's perspective for good or for ill.
Correct. And I think, seen here in the 21st century, our overview is also influenced heavily by New Age literature and portrayals of these forces. And one of the tenets of most of the New Age beliefs, and Wicca in particular, is that do no harm, everything's white. But it still has a bit of the same tensions, because on the other hand, they say, yes, we only do light work, but dark work exists. It's just not us.
Right.
And so you get on the hamster wheel again.
Mm-hmm.
Still.
And I think that for so many of the genuine practitioners with a tie to West Africa, that argument would have been nonsensical.
It is. It is, and it is for a lot of traditional European practitioners as well. I mean, everything has a effect, and it's not necessarily just, quote, your intention. That's a nice little boilerplate to make yourself feel good. I'm probably going to get hate mail over that, but it's true.
And it's the thing that I think is very beautiful is the pragmatism. It is honest. It is authentic. It is saying, and this was something there's this one of the articles that reviewed for tonight's episode, talking about slaves in Jamaica, in recording some of their opinions of the missionaries and the attempt to introduce a Western Protestant belief structure. And one of the overarching ones was the baby Jesus in the manger and a distant God who observes but does not interact on an immediate level. And they're going at one, this, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm just referencing the article. And for full disclaimer, I am a Protestant evangelical Christian myself, but I do enjoy looking at all of these different perspectives. Is basically saying, what good is any of that? You have a baby that can't do anything for me, and you have a distant cosmological deity that is not helping me with my day-to-day existence, and my day-to-day existence is rough.
Mhm.
I need cosmological deities that I give them something, they give me something in return. I need something, I do the right things, they do the thing for me.
Um, I mean, to be perfectly honest, it mirrors society.
Mhm.
You know, um, derision for the source of the statement, but for whatever. But saying takes a village to raise a child, it's the same thing. It takes all of these deities, all of these things, all of these skills
Mhm.
to get through life, especially when life is very hard and oppressive. And those things are very practical and useful, and shows an interaction and a reciprocity of faith and belief, where the deities are believing in you too, so to speak, as much as you do them. And there's something very poetic about that. There's something very real about that. That honestly, if you go back far enough, all around the world, there's a similar affinity in most indigenous peoples' belief systems. And I'm a firm believer that you have that sort of broad interaction for hundreds of thousands of years, really, around the globe. There's something to it.
Yeah, I really do agree with that. And to some degree, you could argue that, an obsession, and I have a deep appreciation for what I would reference as high faith, um, these larger, powerful theological concepts, and the idea that we are called to become better people, we are called to improve and help others improve their lives, and these types of things, what I would classify as high faith, essentially. But there is a beauty in the pragmatism of, we got stuff we got to do.
And we have to figure out how to do it, and you know we need help getting it done. And um yeah, there's just that sense of reciprocity that, and to be honest, it comes out on an issue of fairness. I mean, there's balance. I mean, you're the balance in the scale, so to speak, is that and I certainly can see from their perspective of with the missionaries, that they're asking them to do something that really is very, from their perspective, very one-sided.
It is. It is not only alien, but essentially useless in terms of
Right.
the lives that they were living. And
You're giving me books to read when I need food to eat.
yes, and and also, of course, they were living um, the hypocrisy of the era, because they
Yes.
were being told, you should embrace this sense of high faith because it makes you better people, um, but you will also be tortured if you do not comply.
That, and the people who already have faith in the high faith are the one torturing you.
Yes, yes. Great reference. I think very, very, very introspective, very eye-opening in terms of observation. That as the missionaries were preaching the importance of the crucifixion of Christ, that one of the recorded takeaways in this regard was, No wonder they like this religion so much, because they're the ones who want to do the crucifying.
That there was a lot of intelligence in the person in those statements. I mean, very practical and very intelligent. I mean,
And I think,
intelligent
yeah,
response.
yeah, it's because and that is one of the things, and we see this with the Celts. We clearly see this with the West African diaspora, is that these are individuals who did not were not brought up in the categorization and grid and cube structure of the Romans, of the British Empire, of essentially modern Americanism as
Yeah,
well.
we can blame the Romans. Nice little square boxes with everything,
Yeah,
from our houses to the streets to to how we think.
yeah, I know. Everything's on a grid. I think it's one of the things that is appealing to me about the Ozarks, is that the topography itself prevents the grid from getting too out of hand.
True,
Uh,
true. Or maybe you just have that affinity because it's more like a 1,000-year-old village in the Isles, right?
it's there is such a thing as ancestral memory.
Yeah.
There is such a thing as those associations that stretch across the Atlantic, depending on whether it's to Europe or to Africa, and those things are real. They're powerful, and all of this discussion of cosmology. First of all, I think with the references to the crucifixion, certainly here in the week after Easter, from my perspective, these kind of things are very important, because it calls us to introspection and awareness that we would not otherwise have, and help us to do some self-reflection, and which I would hope that some of the individuals who were recording those Jamaicans during that time, pre-revolution, had some moments of painful introspection and self-reflection, and what I believe could be described by Jung as the dark night of the soul. And I hope that they did. The fact that the records were maintained and preserved suggests that it is real, that did happen, because obviously they could have just gotten rid of the records that they didn't like.
That's true, and the fact that they were preserved it shows that some people involved deserve credit for trying to preserve those issues that could be problematic to them, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. But then taking it a step further, I think all of this discussion is leading toward something that's very important for the rest of the episode, which is understanding the cosmology of pragmatism, the cosmology of practicality. And I think it's in certain circumstances, this idea of this Western, and in some cases very Judeo-Christian, and it's an ethic that I'm strongly in favor of, which is the idea of morality and right and wrong, and these sorts of instilled principles. At the same time, there is an aspect of that is almost a luxury that in other circumstances, with individuals who are bereft of an existent judicial system, an existent infrastructure, really leaves you with a lot of questions. And we have the luxury to be ethical in so many cases today.
Yeah.
That other people, and even some of our own ancestors, did not necessarily have. Mm-hmm. And coming back to the cosmology of practicality that we see with the West African diaspora is, does it work? What are my needs, and does it work? And the perspective on that shifts how you see things. So coming back just to the plants, what do I need, and does it work? And that could be, I have a family member who is suffering, and we need to do something to help them, not help them get better. Okay. Now, our Western ethics would put that in the camp of that's good.
Mm-hmm.
But from a purely pragmatic standpoint, you go to the same person, I'm being abused, I'm being mistreated, someone is hurting me, someone is hurting my family members, somebody is going to take my family members away, and we need to stop them. So how do we poison them? It's the same, toolbox, and it's the same practitioner that you're going to. And it's simply,
Right.
does it work?
And that's, and it's all a matter, and a lot of it is a matter of perspective, and whether or not you've been in that situation or seen enough to know what would you do in this situation, and at what point do the boxes not matter.
Yes, yes.
And to be
And
perfectly honest. And
that's where,
another point is that when you are dealing with, you're dealing with a population, as you said, we have the luxury to pick our ethics and morality today, for the most part. Most people do, because we are in an affluent society. When you are dealing with a population that is under so much stress, and not only just from physical violence potentially or anything, but just you know, lack of subsistence means, not knowing if, you know, you very easily could starve to death, etc., and not receive the modicum of care that other people in your society would. And they consistently cleave to these traditional beliefs and practices. People who are under that kind of physical, mental, and emotional stress don't take the time to continue doing things that they don't see results from.
right. That
I
is
think,
very, very true.
I think that in itself is one of the best arguments for there is something to these things, or they simply wouldn't have continued doing them.
Yeah.
Because their circumstances were not comfortable enough to make, you know, those choices. And often some of these practices would put them in risk of harm or death if they were found out.
It would, because these are practices that had to be done in secret. And I think that what you just brought up really highlights an aspect of these practices that is most often overlooked. Because again, I think that there is a colonialist / post-colonialist bias that is in place. And one aspect of the bias has replaced another. The first bias is, oh, it's super, super bad. Well, and the new bias is, I'm going to say, speaking in very broad generalities, that there's approximately 3 colonialist perspective biases that have taken place. The first one was, oh my gosh, it's really, really bad. The second one is, it's bad, but it's not real. And the third one is, it's incredibly interesting, but it's not real.
That's true. That's true. And that is the state where we're at in a lot of pop culture.
Mm-hmm. I think that does a terrible disservice to a cosmology that, as you noted, if it didn't work, there was no reason whatsoever to continue it.
Exactly. They, you know, there were plenty of things that they could have expended energy and risk on, that wouldn't put them at more threat. People generally don't do that repeatedly if they don't see value in it. And over time, and and one of those counter biases as well, they just thought it was having an effect. It really didn't. Either it was all in the, it's a placebo effect, or we would say today, or they're fooling themselves, etc.
And that in and of itself, I would contend, is a continuance of this idea of West Africans as primitive.
I think that is fair. Although the same analogy is used in other areas and with other groups. So
yes.
And yeah. I think,
and we see it, and you and I are both of Celtic ancestry. We have seen it applied to the Celts.
Oh yes,
many times over, as well as many other people groups. I don't, even though this may be a contentious statement, I don't see it in a classic racial aspect. I see it as an othering.
Yes. The racial aspect is sort of secondary. I don't want to say secondary, but it is not the only primary motive.
I think that the bigger issue, which oftentimes gets lost in terms of the arguments made by authoritarian cultures, is that the authoritarian culture constantly saying, it's not us, we're not the problem, it's you. We're not the problem, it's you. It's you're this, you're that, you're something else. And the argument oftentimes gets made that because it's oftentimes an attempt to contextualize and essentially create a series of reasons why this other group is something that you don't like. And then that takes on sort of its own weather pattern, its own sociological weather pattern. And then we're constantly battling that conversation, but back and forth. But the real issue is an authoritarian, rather monolithic authoritarian structure that's saying this is the worldview that is going to be bulldozed forward. And those that do not fit into that worldview are automatically the other. And whatever that might be, and at various times, and the fact that the actual ancestral makeup of the person or the people group is less of a concern. That may be an excuse, but it's less of an actual concern than the fact that they're not being compliant.
Right.
And I think, again, individuals who have a strong association, and Ozarkers who have a strong association with their ancestral past are drawing back to that Scots-Irish background. And the Scots-Irish dealt with this. The Irish dealt with this. The Scots dealt with this. Cultural erasure, the elimination of their language, the destruction of their cosmology, the constant beratement and belittlement, and saying that you're a lesser person because you're not mentally complying. And then of course we see it applied toward many other people groups as well.
Agreed.
The interesting thing, and I'm going to draw this around to something that's a little closer to home, but again, dealing with the pragmatism of the practicality of the work is something that a lot of these folks who are afraid of revolution, afraid of slave revolt, in many cases afraid of their slaves. One of the things that they were afraid of that draws directly into African spiritual tradition, which is African herbal tradition, is knowing how to poison someone.
That's true. I mean, that is true. And actually, an example in the American South that illustrates this would be the Myrtles Plantation.
That was exactly where I was hoping we would end up. I do
And
not have any oleander leaves on me, but just
exactly. And the story there, and I've been to the Myrtles. It's very beautiful. Very rich energy there. I did not have a paranormal experience, but you could just feel the energy from you just felt like you were walking through ripples in time. And of course the instant case there, and I the name of the slave girl escapes me at the moment. I hadn't thought about talking about this, but she worked in the house, and actually, if I recall correctly, there was a sexual relationship with the master, and she was afraid that she was going to be sent out to the fields, and so she started putting oleander into food of the master's wife and children to make them sick, because she thought that way they would keep her in the house to take care of them. And there was never an intent to kill anyone. She basically wanted to make sure that they were ill enough that they needed her care. And then she accidentally poisoned them, I think, with a cake.
Yes.
And ultimately it came out, actually, if I recall correctly, some of the other slaves turned her in because there was forceful questioning, etc., that we would like to wish had never happened. And she ultimately was killed, I believe hanged, if I recall correctly. And her spirit is one of the spirits that is said to be there, as well as the wife and children.
And of course that, and I believe poisoned with a birthday cake.
I think it was a cake, but I don't remember the occasion. Yeah.
But regardless, there's so much chilling tragedy surrounding every aspect of that. The love triangle, innocent children, quote unquote, being the recipients of this. It's tough. I mean, and it speaks to the disparity of class. It speaks to the herbal practice. It speaks to tragedy. It speaks to darkness. And it essentially, I mean, these are the elements of dark magic encapsulated. And then the fact that there's some reasonably good implication that she continues to haunt the location.
Yes. I mean, of course, the Myrtles is routinely cited as one of the most haunted places in the country. There is it's a few years old now. There is a clip from a local newscast that was on site doing a story, and you see something move behind the reporter, and this is done live. It wasn't even pre-recorded, it was live. And you can find it on the internet. That startled the cameraman and the reporter. So
yeah. And it you think about, and we'll get into this, but I mean, so many locations having similar experiences, having similar, and it's an aspect of Missouri and Arkansas history that is oftentimes overlooked. Within the Ozarks proper, in terms of the heavily mountainous regions, because of the fact that the central Ozarks are so rugged, it was not suitable for plantation style settlement.
Right.
That, and as a result, the African American population in the 19th century in the Ozarks, in those regions, those heavily mountainous regions, were much lower. There are certain areas, particularly in post-war years and during Reconstruction, that there were a handful of communities that were founded, built up, made up of African Americans, former slaves, within the Ozarks, and for the same reason that many different peoples found respite and space within the rugged Ozark Mountains. It was harder to get to. Consequently, under certain circumstances, it was harder for people to give you a hard time. And but there are also a number of locations that comparatively small scale slave ownership took place. And then in other areas, Missouri's Little Dixie area along the Mississippi River, that large scale plantation settlement was an integral part of the pre-war economy.
Yes, along the Mississippi and along the Missouri, and then to some extent, I think along the Arkansas River, a little in Arkansas,
and
not as much.
And of course, in the borderlands on the southeast expanses from the Ozarks, you are almost immediately within the Mississippi River Delta.
Yes, of which, of course, had a lot of plantations.
Yes, a lot of cotton, among other crops. And so these, in something that I think is important to understand, some of our specific stories in terms of these cultural aspects, and in terms of magic and cosmology, may be from other locations. One great reference in Conjuring in the Big House Kitchen, an interpretation of African American belief systems based on the uses of archaeology and folklore sources, is associated with research, archaeological and folkloric research that was done in Maryland, but the belief structures are largely the same from state to state.
Yes, a lot of what I read in there is very indicative of anecdotal evidence from the Ozarks regions and the borderlands. So, which also is an indication of, it's not that these belief systems made it so far into the Caribbean and ended, or made it to the East Coast of the continent and faded out or anything. They persisted over time, and as they were brought westward. And so again, another indication that they had to have value, or they would have been given up as being silly, and they weren't.
Yes, and I wanted to land on this article, The Conjuring in the Big House Kitchen. Was published in 1999, but the research, the archaeological research, goes back a lot earlier, and it was a pre-Civil War mansion, archaeological diggings being done on the grounds and in regards to the structures themselves, beginning in 1981. And with it, so just as a brief overview, because so often it's easy to talk about the ideas, and we've talked about the cosmology and the structure, but I think I want to really dig into what some of these practices specifically are, to the best of our knowledge. In some cases, we can be very specific, but in this case, I found this really interesting. That the archaeological dig resulted in quartz crystals, pierced discs, pierced coins, beads, pins, a rounded black petal, and a white potsherd with a blue asterisk painted in the interior bottom. And the results of this were simply being documented back, when they first came out. but were not, the context of it was not known. It was published more widely, but without context. And shortly after this, the archaeological head was contacted by an individual who was well versed in West African diaspora lore, specifically saying that these materials that you have found would have had to have only been used by African slaves specifically to control spirits who had left the body at death and who had wandered via water back to the sea. And the ending with the sea as the ending point as their source. Those spirits, so directed and controlled by what was being buried in the kitchen, could protect, could cure, and could shape the future. And this was recognizable based upon what they had dug up.
Yes, yes. So a lot of this goes, straight back to the original belief systems in Africa. And one thing that caught my eye, several and they refer to them as catches of these items that they found. They'd be placed under a doorstep, under a windowsill, and in the northeast corners of rooms. And the archaeological article states, well, we know that these kinds of items are put in windowsills and doorways as protection. We don't know why about the northeast corner, and we don't for sure that I have found yet, but I do have thoughts, and one is that these catches or fetishes, as they're referred to in voodoo, are, as you said, they're to control spirits, sometimes to either to control them in a certain way, to have them do things, or to confuse them. And particularly, my thought is, well, the northeast corner has to have significance in West African lore to direct, my guess, the spirit, one, to go northeast, which towards home, towards Africa. Is my sense,
and that would be very, very interesting, and toward water in most cases.
Which, but now the flip side is in Southern African American belief systems, typically it's believed that spirits can't cross water.
Right. There's an interesting dichotomy in that. And I think, and I don't have the answer here, but I think I do have the question. And the question sometimes is the most powerful aspect of it. We see this repeatedly in what I would classify as pre-Western civilization cosmologies, is that two opposite things exist simultaneously.
That's true. And the way you bridge that is that a practitioner can perform craft that basically, I guess, for lack of a better term, that fits our pop culture, create a portal that allows the spirit to cross the water.
And the water motif is unbelievably powerful. And it reminds me, it's very tragic and chilling, but also very beautiful, and terrible simultaneously. The story of the slaves who were brought to South Carolina, and had the auctions, everything, they finished it all up, and I believe they were weighted in their in their iron fetters, and had survived the horrible voyage across the Atlantic. And before anyone could stop them, they clasped hands and walked into the waves.
Mhm.
And and I think that some of those aspects and some of those metaphors speak very powerfully to the spiritual experience, and the perhaps the interaction with the spirits, the association that the water somehow leads home.
Yes, I think so. And uh, and I think that comes through in the contents of these fetishes, of these catches. Another item in there that caught my eye was that there was a blue bead.
Yeah.
And I have to wonder if that was something else that the person talking to the archaeological lead was referring to, because blue beads, I know, are traditionally trade goods among African tribes, basically a form of currency.
Hmm.
So it would be, it would be something that would have that has a very significant connection with that past, and may have continued to mean something of a way of passage, perhaps.
It's powerful contemplation. A couple of things I think we can talk about. One, and I'll lead on this, but and just a little over a year ago, I had the opportunity to go to the Hermitage,
Mm-hmm.
and the mansion itself is extraordinarily beautiful. The the French wallpaper mural of Telemachus is quite memorable. Highly recommend if you're in the Nashville area to absolutely visit the Hermitage. It's 100% well worth your time. Now, I would say my most profound experience was with the larger slave cabin that is at the bottom of the pasture.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot explain this. So, take that with it what you will. But I stepped on the threshold, and it's a block of limestone. It's, from what I can tell, original. The cabin itself is original. There is resonant energy with that threshold. It's associated with the stone.
Well, and that often, would be a place that, fetish would be placed. And I mean, that makes perfect sense, really.
It was very powerful.
And
and,
for
and
anyone who's wondering, that they can serve two purposes. One is for protection, and that's what we tend to hear a lot about in pop culture now. Another is as a ward, to keep things away. And while now we fixate on, say, evil spirits or demonic spirits, then it would be typically just the spirits of the dead that you did not want to come back.
yes, yeah. There's Hermitage has a lot of energy. And some of that is acknowledged. They do have, under very controlled circumstances, paranormal tours. It's during certain seasons, and I think a regional paranormal group conduct some of those. They weren't doing that when I was there, but it is there. And of course, there's a lot of lore, and some fun stories that are associated. Not the least of which is Andrew Jackson showing up on occasion.
Well, that can happen. Before we move on, I wanted to say another thing interesting, of course, in their findings, were cache of pins, and with the photo of them number of them are bent. And if I recall correctly, said they were found where the pins were crossed in 9. Often you would find also in these workings either thread or cord, etc., tied into 9 knots. 9 is a very powerful number when it comes to this cosmology. And for those listening that have read a number of New Age books on witchcraft, this will sound very familiar, because basically this has been lifted from African American culture directly into New Age, quote, spell books.
Very interesting. And that is and a great example of a very, very ancestral tradition getting passed on, but not necessarily, even if the sources are cited, not necessarily having that be part of the awareness that comes with it.
Exactly. And I think it's of note also to think that like with this archaeological dig, that this was still something that was being done at a great risk. These items were found, under the hearth, the door thresholds, windowsills, etc. In the, as it says, the big house. This was the mansion. This was not a slave cabin. And this is throughout. And certainly, it's conjecture, particularly in a particular house, what was the intent? Because again, in this discipline, it can be we're trying to protect the house and everyone here, versus we're trying to protect ourselves from the master or anything in between, or from the dead, etc. That part is much harder to interpret.
It is, and just in terms of coming off of that conversation, a reference to the article written by Yvonne Choureau in the summer of 1997, Conjuring Christianity in the 19th Century, Religious Elements in African American Magic. A very interesting article, and something that really struck out to me was the going a little bit more in depth in this interplay on an aspect of what we now think of as hoodoo that can be very confusing to people, because there is a very unique interweaving of West African tradition with essentially Protestant folk Christianity or rural Protestantism.
Yes, and that is separate from the interplay between that traditional conjuring and Catholicism that evolved into voodoo.
Yes, it is. And it's also, I think, notable, you look at these aspects of rural or mountain Protestantism, in many cases, are being practiced by individuals of Scots-Irish descent. You're again dealing with a group of people who are, to a large degree, poor and or impoverished, that are doing their best to eke a living out of what is initially very, very rough circumstances, very difficult environments with a lot of threats. And you see the many of the higher questions, the more grand theological questions and great socio-political concerns being thrown out the window for issues like, are we going to make it through the winter? Are we going to survive? If we experience an injury, how can we stop the bleeding? If your child is dying, what do we do about it? These types of things. You're suddenly bereft of the luxury of all of this high thinking and deep political thought, and you're just going, how do I make it in some cases through the end of the season, through the winter, maybe even just through the day. And there's some strong similarities, and I can't help but see some interworking, some cross-cultural pollination. And we see that with the effects of essentially rural Protestantism impacting individuals of West African descent who are also practicing root work and these structures of cosmology. And you see it in the herbal aspects. And this was on the Conjuring Christianity in the 19th Century, page 237 of this article, of this book, references to the healing plants or the protective plants and the names that were being associated with it: angel's root, devil's shoestring, bowels of Christ, blood of Jesus leaf, Samson's root, St. John's wort or High John the Conqueror, the leaves of the peace plant, the king of the woods. These types of things, this interworking or interlocking combination of West African tradition and Protestant Christianity in a rural folk setting, and the individuals who were practicing it, again, were approaching it with such pragmatism that when they were questioned as to this supposed dichotomy of how can you be practicing these two separate things, they were going, because it works.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And there's a specific account there from a minister who he himself being interviewed. This was shortly before the turn of the 19th century. So this would have been the late 1700s, collecting folklore. And they interviewed African-American clergyman and they described him as one of the most scholarly and noted ministers of, quote, the colored race. But he admitted that even as a professed Christian, he was under the influence of Voodooism and other African occult practices, and gave the example that when he started out as a minister, he was having a hard time attracting worshipers. And then a visitor told him that he should get you a hand as a friend and to draw them. And they were referring to a conjurer. And he ultimately accepted a talisman. And
it worked.
And it worked. The very next week, the church was full. And that when the luck charm, basically he came to a point where the boxes were testing him, as we were saying earlier, the boxes of how do you put things in different boxes, and felt like he shouldn't be relying on this as a Christian minister, and so he destroyed the talisman, and he had never drawn a congregation as large again.
And there's a lot of, I would say, popularized New Age belief structures that could speak into this, but I think it really should be the other way around, because we're dealing with ancient traditions that, again, when they are, from what we can tell, done correctly, create things, manifest things, and move things in directions that are oftentimes very foreign to our current way of thinking.
Exactly. I think maybe an analogy for people is, we talk about having the right frame of mind for something, or the right attitude to persevere through, say, a hard task at work or whatever. And basically what we're saying is this, it's how you look at things and how you interact with what's going on. And it's the same, it's the sort of the flip side of that coin. We just tend to think, oh, what we're saying is one way, and that's something completely different, when in reality, it may not be.
It very well may not be. And coming back, same article, page 233, there was a reference to Missouri and there was a reference to Arkansas. And I like that because we can cite documentation that ties this to the Ozarks regions, at least as close as the state. Late 1800s, a folklorist interviewed occult specialist who met regularly in a Missouri African Methodist church. The potential conflict between conjure and Christianity was pointed out by the writer, who described an individual who would regularly conjure, and then was also very disciplined about attending church every Sunday.
And again, I think, especially in this belief system, it's not either or yes or no proposition.
No.
And it's certainly not in even the more sort of visible voodoo context that is more visible to outsiders today. So
true. And just in continuing that, the Arkansas reference, a quote unquote, post Civil War Arkansas, quote unquote, a former bondsman practiced to conjure on unsuspecting victims out of, quote, meanness, and belonged at the same time to a local Baptist congregation. Another late 19th century Arkansas conjurer was renowned in 3 counties for his alleged role in the deaths of at least 10 men and women by occult means, who was also referenced as a pious man and a deacon in the church.
Well, again, we don't know all the circumstances.
And it comes down to, you do what you got to do. And I think that aspect of the situation at hand is something that if we're very honest with ourselves, have to understand that we could probably relate more to that than we would like to think. We then ask ourselves, what if we were given access to that kind of power? And I think that's where a lot of the fear innately originates.
Oh, I think that's accurate. And I think it's worthy of note too that for those that were practicing conjurers in this tradition, that the spirit realm was very present, and it was not like a cosmos, set in stone. It was an interactive a potentially dangerous situation that could strike at even the most pious men.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of that, walking that line between even being a minister and practicing hoodoo, even a conjurer, is that dealing with forces that attacked the faithful and the pious.
Very, very true. And in some cases, the rural Protestantism, I think, really spoke into this, in the idea that there is a supernatural world of evil that you need protection from. And the idea, and certainly the argument in many of cases, and it's referenced in this article, is that God gave certain know-how to certain people, and God gave us certain tools to protect ourselves. And so you go to the person who knows how to do that if you think you are at risk.
Yes, yes. And for some, and that seems to be a little harder notion to reconcile now than it was, say, 100, 150 years ago for a lot of
And
people.
and I think that it's dealing with that. It's dealing with something that we really have yet to fully come to grips with as a larger discussion, because there is a conflation, ultimately a conflation, between the extreme rational side of the Enlightenment and its association with the church, that at various times finds expression that we're still dealing with, and predominantly coming into the paranormal realm, dealing with the fact that, quite frankly, a lot of my fellow Southern Baptists have issue with the type of paranormal research that I do, because they're all evil, it's bad. Or another, which is not just within Southern Baptists, but just generally across the board with modern day or everyday modern Christians, the idea that it's perfectly okay to accept the distant existence of supernatural realities, because that doesn't get in the way of our modern Enlightenment, modern educational system, secularism. But the problem with ghosts is that gets awfully close to home, and we don't like that.
This is reminding me of a certain conversations in a cafe in Greenfield. You may or may not remember.
Oh, good times. Good times.
Yeah. Yes. To which my response to those questions, I think, surprised someone. Not you, but someone.
And it's and the thing that I consistently encourage people around me is just the importance and sometimes the discomfort of having an open mind in these regards.
Oh, definitely. And that is, having an open mind and being able to hold seemingly contradictory views at the same time, it can be very disconcerting to a lot of people.
Yes. And oftentimes, though, and I think is that our disparate simultaneous views oftentimes are not as disparate in reality as we keep trying to think that they are.
Very true. Very true.
I would. Oh, go ahead.
And it's kind of funny because actually in this article, there's a statement. This is actually in a footnote on 241 that my use of magic as a category distinct from other religious means of mediating the supernatural may be misleading, because again, it's sits half dozen ways the other in certain respects.
It is, and I think it's very. These are issues that each generation must grapple with. And
that's a very interesting point. I'm glad you said that, because, and I think I think in some ways it's harder to grapple these issues when aspects of this are so much based on oral tradition and handed down from practitioner to practitioner. Which leaves sort of one side of the conversation very quiet versus the other side.
that's a very good point.
And so the negotiation and the re-understanding of it over time ends up starting from square one. Instead of building on sort of building on the conversations over time, you are repeatedly starting over.
True, true, and that's a difficult place to land. I'm very grateful for that, and a lot of our source materials for tonight's episode are proof that there is a considerable amount, even a surprising amount of documentation um, on the subject. But this is documentation that is, interestingly enough, not part of our larger pop culture discussion, and it's documentation that is tucked away in research libraries and universities, and is not part of the larger, just the larger milieu of understanding.
Very true. Even when you are specifically talking about these subjects, a lot of what is out there in pop culture discussions, and I'm not saying that in any derision, but just sort of in the sort of the more casual or hobbyist enthusiast realms, and even some practitioners, you don't see that depth of information. Kind of reminds me of the archives of the Vatican, that you can't check out the book unless you know what to ask for, and they won't tell you what they have. So it's the same process.
Yeah, I'm honestly wondering if the entire Library of Alexandria isn't in there.
I hope it is. I really do.
I do too. I do too. So, what are some of the actual, practices that come to mind that may have been that you feel that really stand out?
Oh, for conjuring, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
As it relates to current practice and discussions, or
Current, or just things, based on our research or investigations.
well, for me, that there's a real sense of affecting the environment with some of these things, and that I can't quantify empirically, but based on my own experience investigating at locations where there were conjurings, and some that were actually from that time period with enslaved populations. My own experience is, as we said, sometimes it just works, that things such as offerings, because part of the practice would be making offerings for the dead, those that you want help from. On the other hand, you might do some other things to keep ones away that you don't want to come back. And that sense of exchange and that sense of permission, I guess, would be the way I look at it when we're dealing with investigations, because it's an acknowledgement of their existence, of their validity, and of, again, reciprocity. I mean, it's, when we walk into a location and say, hello, everyone, that's really a part of this tradition. It's a continuation of these things. When we say we're acknowledging them, it is a continuation of this tradition specifically. Offerings of tobacco and whiskey or rum, often at locations with more violent, or violent meaning chaotic activity, I don't want to use the word violent in the sense of, dangerous or harming people, often does seem to have an effect. Again, I can't pull out a calculator and say, it reduced activity by 13.5% or something like that, but a palatable difference. And I think that's something in the Western mindset that we have a trouble with, to say, I don't have to quantify everything to say it was significant.
It was significant. There was a noticeable change. Something that
you don't have to have a bell curve for everything.
Yes, and again, as an aspect of offering something that that we were referencing in the mirror magic episode, the old, I believe, Southern European tradition of setting up mirrors and then placing food into the mirror's reflection to feed the spirit. Something that is consistent is with hoodoo, voodoo, obia. I suspect Santeria, although I'm less familiar with Santeria specifically, is offerings. And the offerings typically are things like white sugar, rum, whiskey, tobacco, eggs,
rice,
and and then again, to a Western mind, or to a strict interpretation on Protestantism, these things can seem very either very old-fashioned, very primitive, and they could seem very wrong. But we're really speaking to ancient traditions that were carried on from generation to generation by individuals with a much more personal understanding of how the supernatural world on an everyday basis works.
Yes, and I think, again, as you said, for many, the supernatural is at arm's length, and for this tradition, it is very personal and everyday. And to be honest, I tend to view it that way as myself. So it's just part and parcel with life. But
it is, and I appreciate the fact that clearly some of these spirits appreciate good whiskey. that seems to be a condition. A condition and in the offering is that it should be the best whiskey you got, not the worst whiskey that you got.
Very true. That's very, very true. And Josh will be the taste tester.
I absolutely will.
And another thing that often was used, like, again, the use of nines, buttons with holes, often pierced in them, additional to the normal holes for the button, things like this, because discs were often used as amulets, or as to be worn, etc., which again is no different than a hagstone.
True. Very, very true.
Something about, something with the hole that it can be worn, often to be worn as a necklace or as an ankle bracelet. And often in this tradition, you would a button or a coin, and you would burn it and then wear it, particularly if it came from a person that you were trying to affect in whatever way. Yeah.
Very, very powerful, very interesting, and perhaps some of the disconcerting aspects that people have, the unsettling aspects, is that so many of the tools of the practice are everyday objects that if you don't know their significance, you won't recognize what they're being used for.
Well, that's correct. Just as, in the list of items that you read earlier, the bowl with the marking in the bottom that was painted blue. Well, I imagine it was paint blue.
Mm-hmm.
And paint blue specifically is color used to repel spirits.
Yes. So think about that the next time you see a bottle tree in somebody's yard.
Exactly. I think another interesting aspect of this is the very close connection in this lore with cemeteries and practitioners. A lot of ceremonies or spells, conjurings would be conducted in cemeteries. Often graveyard dirt is used. Oftentimes goofer dust. Sometimes more modernly, people will substitute red brick dust, but that the cemetery itself became an aspect of the realm of magic in a different way than the European sense.
That's a really good point, and I think that some of that has definitely impacted pop culture.
I think so. I mean, certainly there are, tales of spectral phantoms and cemeteries, in the European tradition, but not with the same connotation of fear, perhaps malevolence, danger that there is in North America. And I think it goes back to this tradition.
Digging into that is powerful. You think about some of the occultic folk references that we see with graveyards and black cats in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And of course we're dealing with a Mississippi culture in that regard, something. And again, we're dealing with fragments of a belief structure that are fragments that are embedded in our psyche.
Right. They're not conscious often, even.
No. And if they are conscious, we might recognize the thing, but there's a good chance we don't know from whence the thing came. And I think the graveyard dust, the graveyard dirt and the goofer dust is a great example of that. We see so many references to this practice in blues.
Mm-hmm.
And just throughout that entire aspect of culture, even so much so that I think many people could listen to the songs and not realize that they're talking about these practices and of course that's made its way into modern rock and roll as well.
That's true. Another aspect of that is that it was common for graves in cemeteries to be decorated with items that would have been of use to the spirit if they were wandering or whatever. A bowl of water might be everyday items that, from the European sense, it didn't make a lot of sense why that would be. But then you fast forward to today, and how often is it that you are in a cemetery and you find items left at a grave that you go, why leave this or that? I remember I remember being in a cemetery some years ago. I was looking for a particular grave and came across a grave, and it was decorated, but with items that certainly make more sense in this regard than anything else. There was an antique iron. I remember that. A teacup, and just sort of several sundry items that you staying there looking at. Why this combination? It's not even something you'd say, oh, this is, leaving toys on a child's grave because they would enjoy playing with them, or a collection type thing. Just seemingly disparate items, that just household items that were obviously placed intentionally, which would make much more sense in this tradition.
Yes.
European tradition. But then it's become much more common for people to leave various things on tombstones.
True. And
it comes from this tradition.
and sometimes even unconsciously.
Right.
And it is definitely a shift. I think a more European, New England idea in terms of graveyards is one that balances somewhere between austerity and the city park.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
And that's a space that does not traditionally hold space for, hey, I grabbed a whole bunch of stuff I thought you might like out of the dollar store and stuck it on your grave, which happens and with increasing frequency today.
It does, and I'm not sure that anyone even really understands, the source of that, but or often. Something else I was going to pose to you, because it ties into our last episode on spiritualism.
Yes.
And you may know where I'm going with this, but I find it's interesting that Abraham Lincoln plays a very large role in this tradition, as well as spiritualism.
Honest Dave got around after his death.
Yes. And if you didn't listen to the episode on seances and spiritualism, one, go listen to it. But secondly, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, other founding fathers, often made appearances at seances in the post-Civil War period, and
along with Thomas Paine and William Shakespeare.
Yes, we cannot forget them, and even Julius Caesar at times. So, but an interesting company. But
it was a busy room.
Yes, but Lincoln often did, and it's interesting that during the Civil War and afterwards, Lincoln often was incorporated into ghost stories in African American culture.
Yes, I found that incredibly fascinating, and really a powerful commentary, sort of a meta commentary on how Lincoln was seen.
Exactly. And in Elliot Gorn's article, Black Spirits, the Ghost Lore of Afro-American Slaves, he makes the reference to a statement by actually a former slave named Tom Wyndham, that about old Father Abraham Lincoln. I've seen him since he been dead too. I got an old gun old Father Abraham gave me right out of his own hand at Pittsburgh. I'm going to keep it until I die too. Yes, man, I know these spirits. And just a real connect. But I think that statement is a good illustration of the idea of the dead interacting with the living in a way that different than most Europeans would view it.
That's really true. That's really true. And I think it speaks on a personal level that goes beyond a lot of the more structured European traditions of the dead are here to say something, they're here to finish some business, they're here to, accomplish something and then move on. This is subtly different in terms of its manifestation.
Agreed. And there's an interesting analogous situation that goes on in these tales of you have someone like Abraham Lincoln coming back, but you have not only ancestral spirits, which would also be favorable, but there's a lot of lore about dead slave owners coming back and dealing with them.
And not favorably. That's
favorably.
And individuals of and I think that this speaks on multiple levels. I think that it speaks to the trauma, the fear that a certain number of individuals were experiencing at any given moment at the hands of their owners, at the hands of the owners and the masters, and seeing some of the ghost lore really reads more like post-traumatic stress disorder.
It really does. Even statement from Frederick Douglass that's quoted in the article, that he often would spend Sundays staring at Chesapeake Bay, pondering his fate and torment from these, from specters. Interesting thing is that from a PTSD standpoint, you would think, yes, there would be triggers, etc. But an interesting part of this is that often these ghost tales involving dead slaveholders, they came back with almost supernatural powers. Almost reading on par of a vampire coming back, or the undead, a reverend of some sort that terrorizing them more now than when they were alive.
It's very chilling.
Yeah, which I do think there definitely is a PTSD aspect to this, I'm sure, but it seems like there's something more that which from the European mindset we don't want to even consider, that on the other side the dead may have more power than they do as when they're living.
Right, and that's this is something that speaking into modern paranormal investigations and sort of our modern ghost lore, that we really struggle with the dichotomy of this. On one hand, I think we are gratuitously engaged in it. On the other hand, we want to go, nope, that's not the case. And I've heard just on one-on-one conversations with individuals in regards to our investigative work, my investigative work on the ground, that on one hand, individuals being terrified to go into a location, and you go, well, what are you afraid of? Ostensibly, they're afraid that the ghosts are going to do something to them.
Right.
That's the takeaway. But I also, go ahead.
No, I just said that is a fear that people do express.
And at the same time, I've had conversations with people who who go, I've thought about this. If ghosts are real, they're disembodied. They can't interact with the living. They can't interact with physical objects. So what am I scared of? And I'm
Yeah.
like, well, we're half right.
Yeah, exactly. Meanwhile, today in 3 different buildings I've been in, had single lights flash on and off as I walked past. So,
There was one again in the ghost lore that one of the references to haunted quilts.
yes.
A female slave brought 2 quilts from the estate of a white woman who died shortly after making them. That night, the slave woman and her son could not sleep because the quilts kept pinching their toes.
Which, again, comparing to investigations and haunted sites, there are a lot of places that actually that very thing is reported behavior of either being touched while you're sleeping under a blanket or the blanket being pulled and things like that. So,
There's definitely a consistency in that. Another story, Sarah Douglas from Alabama told of being raised by an extremely brutal mistress. Quote, "Old Miss was very strict on us," the former slave recalled. "And after she died, we were so glad. We had a big dance in Mrs. Kitchen, and Old Miss came back and slapped one of the slaves and left the print of her hand on her face."
and again, there are times that people report handprints, on their skin, things like that. So those again are analogous to things that go on today.
And I think the other that really stood out to me in this was a let's see here. The having a slave master dying and reported that he had left buried treasure. They go to dig it up, and during the process, one of the men who's doing the digging suddenly, it's as though he's being whipped, with the lash welts appearing and the blood coming through his shirt, as though someone is there whipping him. And I think again that really speaks to a couple of things that are very unsettling. One, the level of fear that some of these men instilled in those around them, and really the horror of and brutality of that humanity is capable of, and the scars that leaves behind. But it also speaks to a belief in a structure that is typically only explored in our more salacious paranormal films, of the ghosts being able to genuinely harm the living.
True. And by the same token, there were tales of slaveholders being absolutely, just as terrified of spirits of dead slaves coming back.
Yes.
Which I think is in a bit interesting. I mean, it obviously speaks to sort of that even unconscious knowledge of what today would be called karma or dharma, fear of receiving treatment that you had met out. But I think it's that in itself goes to show that both sides in this equation viewed ghosts as real, as powerful, being able to interact and, affecting you, certainly emotionally and physically.
Yes.
Whereas today, and that in itself, I think it is sort of that tell that, oops, in Jamaica, we make all the fuss about the law, and it's, they're just pretending, but in reality, we know they're not, because we don't want to see them in the bedroom after someone's died. And to be honest, I think, that both sides are being, honest in those fears and in recognition that things are being affected. Whereas today you get that dichotomy, nope, it can't be, or sometimes just the opposite. Everything is, everything's paranormal, everything can hurt you, or nothing can hurt you.
Right. There's an unwillingness to walk down that center, and there is that, the concern, and I think this is where that extraordinarily complex oral cosmology is suddenly so apparent in its absence, because we're looking at these ancient traditions and cosmologies that would contextualize, for example, these are our ancestors. These are the vengeful dead. Those are not the same. And that, these, as opposed to, these are, spirits that exist, elemental, inhuman spirits that are benign or possibly helpful if placated, as opposed to the ones that are mischievous tricksters, as opposed to the ones that are unbelievably dangerous and you do not poke them with a stick. And that this grander cosmology, this grander and incredibly complex unseen world, is that it makes sense on its terms, and that we have, even at our access, particularly in terms of the even contemporary West African animism traditions and lore and understanding and belief structures, we have this extremely profound knowledge available to us, but we're still floundering around out here going, either it doesn't exist, or it's all good, or it's all bad. And those are basically the we're still dealing with the options, basically, of chocolate, vanilla, or swirl.
Yes.
And instead there's a dizzying complexity. But from what I can tell, just going from the West African animism, these are dizzying complexities that, if you are raised within the oral traditions, have complex but sensible and workable structure.
Yes. And I think remove it from the realm of the paranormal, and most people recognize that that's true with so many things in life. I mean, aspects in life, in different fields, etc., is that it all has a structure within itself that, if you're versed in it, it makes sense, but to outsiders it does not. But you have to verse yourself in it.
Yes.
And there's a resistance on a lot of people in becoming versed in cosmologies.
Yeah. and even just from the aspect that it's complex.
That's true. I mean, math hurts,
Right. There's there's a certain amount of rigor, and I think this would mm, prove irritating to a number of people within the Western civilization mindset. A a surprising amount of objective rigor that is required to understand these complexities.
Agreed. Now I'm going to throw the question back to you. What do you see in this tradition that comes up in the current paranormal field or pop culture the most?
Oh, in terms of pop culture, I think that there's a number of fairly obvious ones. Just the tropes associated with voodoo,
Hmm.
and those are tropes that certainly have an important standing, um, but it's important to understand them within within their negative context, and come to the realization that for example, voodoo is a vast, complex and deeply respected religious structures, religion within that. Um, Within the Ozarks, various aspects of witchcraft and power doctors is
Hmm.
influenced by these traditions. And I think that it is of particular note that the what we would classify today as the marginalized peoples tended to gather together and share information on certain levels.
Hmm.
And what you see in that in terms of creating its own folk traditions within the Ozarks is African Americans and poor whites practicing from the outside looking in, or for contemporary definitions, contemporary, at the during the era definitions, that they were practicing witchcraft of whatever kind seemed to work for them.
Right.
And so those, the tropes again of conjurings in the graveyard, conjurings between midnight and 2 o'clock. The idea that there's certain people that you fear, that that you don't, either you don't want to get on their bad side, or that of someone that got on their bad side and then something mysteriously happened to them that was bad. Those
Yes.
types of, and from a standpoint of conjure, and taking it from the position that conjure is real when it is practiced effectively, that it could be, under the right circumstances, a very potent form of justice, because you could fix something and someone in a way that you cannot by the rules of the Enlightenment tie back to the perpetrator.
Very true. Very true. It just came to mind on investigations of. I think there could be an argument made that, particularly in the way that some trigger objects are going, as trigger objects are being manufactured to incorporate devices such as EMF detectors, etc. They work very much the same way, or investigators are hoping they do in much the same ways as a lot of these conjuring practices do, as to either to attract, repel the spirits. Let's put an EMF detector in a teddy bear, and maybe, and that's going to have more effect than just laying the device out separately.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a powerful line of thought. I think, and I may get hate mail on this. I think that a great deal of current investigative processes are still very primitive in comparison, for example, to tonight's discussion, the topic, not our
Mhm.
discussion, but our subject matter, which again, West African animism as an overall or overarching topic is vastly more contextual and intelligent than what a lot of us typically, and a lot of people are doing in terms of investigation or trying to touch the paranormal.
I agree there. But it is interesting that in some ways some of these aspects are being brought into it, and people wouldn't realize that for the most part unless they were versed in the lore. Um,
Yeah.
but and I do find it interesting, and to be perfectly honest, I haven't necessarily seen that those attempts are any more successful. So
Mhm. It's fun to watch though, and
it is.
I and it's very interesting.
Well, I mean, it is, but again, I've often with as these devices are turned into trigger objects and vice versa. I often ask as I'm watching people do that, I'm like, who do you think you're fooling? And I think sometimes they fool themselves more than anything. That the EMF detector alone versus being in a teddy bear or a doll or whatever is going to be of any more or less interest than either object separately.
That's an interesting observation, and I think it's worth the consideration. I think that we oftentimes aren't necessarily applying the level of sort of larger mm, universal intelligence or grander complex intelligence that seems to be associated with the other world when
Well,
we're interacting with it.
I mean that's very true, and especially coming at it in the postmodern sense. We're kind of we are kind of stumbling around in the dark and trying to you know uh, see what we can bump into and if it works.
True, true. So my recommendation is study hoodoo and West African animism, and then proceed carefully and with caution on your investigation.
Yes, I think that is good advice. Again, proceed as you're comfortable.
Mhm.
And with that interesting note, perhaps that's a good place to leave off. We want to remind everyone not to forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be discussing the Oklahoma Ozarks. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.